Your own parents are supposed to be the people who protect you from the world. Mine decided to become the reason the world shut its doors on me. For 3 years, every job I tried to get vanished before I even had a chance to prove myself. Not because I was unqualified, not because I failed an interview, but because someone had already called ahead and told them I was a criminal. Someone who knew exactly where to strike, so no one would ever give me a chance. My name is Caroline Johansson. I'm 28 years old now, but the story really begins 3 years earlier, in a small town where I grew up. Harlem, Ohio. A place with barely 4,000 people, one grocery store, one high school, and a diner that hadn't changed its menu since the late 80s. It was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast. The Johanssons, my family, were considered respectable. My dad, Gerald, had worked as a plant manager at the Harlan manufacturing facility for nearly 2 decades before it shut down. My mom, Denise, volunteered at the Thanksgiving food drive every year. From the outside, we looked like the example people pointed to when they talked about good families. Inside the house, things were different. I didn't get my own key until I was 20. If I drove more than 10 miles away, I had to call and explain where I was going. When I was 14, I started working after-school busing tables at the Route 30 diner. Minimum wage, nothing special. My paychecks went into a joint account my mom opened for safekeeping. I never saw the statements. I never questioned it. That was simply how things worked. School was the one place where I felt like I might have another future. I graduated valedictorian. My guidance counselor pulled me aside during senior year and told me I could earn scholarships, real ones, to go to college. I brought the brochures home. My dad didn't even open them. He set them on the kitchen counter and said, "College is for people who can't work with their hands." And that was the end of the conversation. So I stayed. I cooked, cleaned, mowed the lawn, helped my mom in the garden, and listened to my dad talk every night at dinner about how the world was getting worse. Then he would look across the table at me and say the same thing. "You've got a roof, food, and family. What more does a girl your age need?" For a long time, I didn't have an answer. Until the week after my 25th birthday. There was no argument.
No dramàtic moment.
I was just standing in the kitchen, scrubbing the same cast iron skillet I'd been scrubbing since I was 12. And suddenly a thought hit me like a stone through glass. If I stayed here, I would still be standing in that exact spot at 40 years old. That idea terrified me more than anything my father had ever said. The next morning I walked to the public library and sat down at one of the old computers in the back. Sticky keyboard, 15-minute time limit. I created a new email account, one my parents didn't know about. Then I found a job listing 20 minutes away in Millfield. A hardware store needed a full-time sales associate. I typed my application slowly with 2 fingers and pressed send before I could lose my nerve. 2 days later, they emailed back. They wanted to interview me Thursday morning. I read the message 3 times before closing the screen. As I walked home, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Dinner that night was strangely quiet. My dad sat at the head of the table, newspaper beside his plate. My mom stood at the sink washing dishes that were already clean. No one said much of anything. The next morning I drove to Millfield for the interview. The manager, a man named Bill, greeted me with a smile and a handshake. But once we sat down, the smile faded. My application lay on the desk between us. "Caroline," he said gently, "I'm going to ask you something directly. Is there anything in your background we should know about?" I blinked, confused. "No, sir." He removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead. "We received a phone call yesterday," he said slowly. "Someone claimed you had a felony theft charge." The room spun. "That's not true," I said immediately. "I've never even been arrested." Bill looked like he wanted to believe me. "But businesses can't run on hope." "I'm sorry," he said. "We can't move forward." I drove home in silence. When I pulled into the driveway, my dad was sitting on the porch reading the newspaper. He didn't even look up. "How was your day, sweetheart?" I stared at the back of the paper in his hands. "Fine," I said quietly. "Good," he replied. "Your mom made pot roast." Dinner continued like nothing had happened. Pot roast, green beans, iced tea. My mom talked about the neighbor's new fence while my dad nodded along. But a thought had already begun forming in my mind. A small, awful thought. Did they know? Over the next 6 weeks, I applied to 3 more jobs. A grocery store, a warehouse, another diner. Every single one scheduled an interview. And every single one canceled within 2 days. The diner owner, a woman named Pat, finally told me the truth. She leaned across the counter and lowered her voice. "Honey, someone called here about you." My stomach tightened. What did they say? That you had a criminal record. Theft and fraud. The caller said she was a concerned neighbor. A concerned neighbor. That night, after my parents went to bed, I slipped into my mom's sewing room. I opened the desk drawer and found a small blue notebook. Inside were neat columns written in my mother's careful handwriting. Millfield Hardware, Ridgeway Fresh Mart, County Line Logistics, Cooperton Family Diner. Every job I had applied to. And next to each name was a red check mark. I stood there in the dark holding that notebook as the truth settled over me like ice. This wasn't coincidence. My own mother had been keeping a list, tracking me. The next morning, I placed the notebook on the kitchen table.
My mom froze when she saw it.
Coffee spilled across the counter. "You went through my things," she whispered.
"You called my employers," I said.
"You told them I'm a criminal." "I did it because I love you," she cried. "The world is dangerous. You don't understand what can happen to a girl alone." "I'm 25, I said. "I'm not a girl." My dad calmly set down his toast. "We're protecting you, Caroline," he said. "You think you can survive out there?" "If you don't stop," I said quietly, "I'm leaving." He didn't even hesitate. "Walk out that door," he said, "and you leave with nothing." That night, I packed a single backpack. When I stepped into the hallway, my mom stood there with her arms crossed. "If you leave," she said coldly, "you're dead to us." I walked outside, anyway. Then I checked my bank account. Balance, 0. Every dollar I had ever earned was gone. And as I walked down the driveway with $12 in my pocket, no ID, and nowhere to go, my father sent one final message.
"Come home.
Apologize. And maybe I'll stop." I ended the call before he could finish. My finger hit the red button, and I placed the phone face down on the thin shelter mattress. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the effort it had taken to keep my voice steady for those 2 minutes. He never called again. From that point forward, it was only texts, once a week, sometimes twice. Always the same careful tone. Messages designed to sound warm while tightening the leash just a little more. "Thanksgiving's coming. Your mom's making pie. Saw your friend Katie at the store.
She asked about you."
Getting cold out there? Shelters can't be warm. Each message was a hook, cast into the water to see if I'd bite. And every one of them carried the same quiet accusation, that I was the one who had broken the family, the one who needed to crawl back and apologize. I saved every text. At the time, I didn't know why. I just had a feeling I needed to keep everything. Every message, every date, every word. Looking back, that instinct turned out to be the smartest thing I did that entire year. After the call, I lay on my shelter bed staring at the ceiling for a long time. One question kept circling in my mind.
Why?
Why would your own parents rather see you homeless than independent? I still don't have a perfect answer for that. But during those quiet nights at the shelter, when the building settled and someone coughed 2 beds away and the heater hummed against the wall, I found myself thinking about my grandmother, Margaret Johansson. Everyone called her Maggie. She had lived on a 40-acre farm outside Ridgeway. Chickens wandering the yard, a big garden behind the house, and a barn she repainted white every spring because, as she liked to say, it keeps things honest. She sold that farm 3 years before she died. I was 23 when her heart gave out. Quick and sudden. At the funeral, my father cried exactly once during the eulogy, then went back to shaking hands and accepting casseroles like he was hosting a community dinner. But one memory kept resurfacing. About a year before she passed, Grandma had invited me out to the farm. The new owners hadn't moved in yet, so the place still felt like hers. We sat on the porch drinking sweet tea while the fields stretched out in front of us. At one point, she said something that didn't make sense to me then. "If things ever get real bad," she told me quietly, Someone will come find you. Don't be scared when they do. I laughed, thinking she was joking. Grandma, what are you talking about? She didn't laugh back. She just stared across the fields. I know my son, sweetheart, she said softly. I've known him for 50 years. Then she changed the subject like she hadn't said anything strange at all. Asked about my mom's garden, whether the tomatoes had come in yet. As I was leaving, she added one more thing. I sold the farm, she said, but I didn't spend the money. Remember that. At the time it sounded like a random comment. 5 months later, lying on bed 14 in the shelter and staring at a water stain shaped like the state of Ohio, I suddenly remembered every word. The memory might have faded again if Linda hadn't brought something else up a few days later. I was organizing the supply closet, stacking toilet paper, lining up cleaning spray, when she leaned against the doorway. Caroline, she said carefully, remember that woman who came by last month asking about you? I froze. The one looking for me?
Yeah.
Ruth something. I didn't give her any information, shelter policy. But she left a card. Linda pulled it from her pocket and handed it to me.
Ruth Kalan.
Licensed private investigator. State of Ohio. I read it twice. A private investigator. My first thought was immediate and ugly. My father had hired someone to find me. It felt exactly like his style. Track me down. Report my location. Maybe try to remove me from the shelter with some new lie. What did she look like? I asked. Mid-50s, Linda said. Short gray hair.
Calm.
Polite. She hesitated. Honestly, she didn't seem like trouble. She looked like someone searching for a person she cared about. I slipped the card into my pocket, but I didn't call. I wasn't ready to walk straight into whatever trap my parents might have set. They had already outmaneuvered me too many times. Still, I couldn't throw the card away. Every time I washed my clothes, I moved it into the clean pair of jeans. Something about the way she'd come to the shelter instead of hiding behind a phone bothered me in a way I couldn't explain. My parents never confronted things directly. They worked from the shadows. Anonymous calls. Fake documents. Quiet sabotage. This woman had knocked on the front door and left her name. By month 7, life at the shelter had started to stabilize a little. My replacement birth certificate finally arrived in the mail, and after weeks of delays the DMV issued me a temporary ID. Holding that card with my own photo on it felt like a victory far bigger than it should have. But the calm didn't last long. One afternoon Linda asked me to step into her office. The door was closed, which never happened. Normally she propped it open with a blue brick she'd painted herself. Sit down, she said gently. I did. I got a call today, she continued. A woman claiming to be a social worker. My stomach tightened. She said you have a documented history of violence, Linda went on, and that you pose a risk to other residents. The room suddenly felt colder. That was my mother, I said quietly. Linda nodded. I figured. Social workers don't cold call shelters to smear someone's reputation. What did you tell her? I told her I couldn't discuss residents. She leaned forward. But I'm documenting the call. And I need to be honest. If she files a formal complaint through the county system, I may not be able to protect your spot here. My parents had drained my bank account, stolen my documents, destroyed my job opportunities. And now they were trying to take away the one place I had left to sleep. But instead of panic, something inside me changed. The fear faded. What replaced it wasn't anger either. Anger burns fast and messy. This felt different.
Clear.
Focused. Like someone had wiped a fogged-up window clean. A week later, Harland held its monthly town council meeting at the community center. Folding chairs, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a microphone that screeched if you stood too close. Linda told me my father had signed up to speak. So I went. I sat quietly in the back row wearing a borrowed jacket, hoping no one would recognize me. At 7:22 p.m., Gerald Johansson stepped up to the podium wearing his best blue shirt. His voice cracked as he began. I'm here as a father, he said. My daughter left home and fell into bad company. She's living in a shelter now. I've tried to bring her home, but she refuses. In the front row, my mother dabbed her eyes while neighbors reached over to comfort her. I'm just asking this community, my father continued, to help me reach my little girl. The room filled with sympathy. People started turning around, glancing toward the back where I sat. In their eyes, the story was already decided. He was the grieving father. I was the ungrateful daughter. No one asked me to speak. The meeting moved on like nothing had happened. I wrote down every word he said in my notebook and walked out through the side door. After that night, the town made up its mind about me. Job inquiries suddenly disappeared. People who used to nod politely stopped meeting my eyes. Even one of the shelter volunteers gently told me maybe I should just go home. Because in a small town, when the person accusing you is crying in public, nobody listens to the one being accused. The pressure around me kept tightening. A few days after the council meeting, someone from a local congregation called the shelter. Not from any specific church, just a concerned member of the faith community suggesting that maybe a family reconciliation meeting would help everyone heal. Linda declined politely on my behalf. By then it was obvious what was happening. My parents had turned the entire town into their surveillance system. Every sympathetic neighbor, every volunteer, every well-meaning stranger who had seen my father standing at that podium with tears in his eyes, they all became pieces of the same trap. But one thought kept returning to me. Someone will come find you. My grandmother's voice. And the business card sitting in my pocket.
Ruth Kalan.
Private investigator. At that point, I had nothing left to lose. The shelter was the only barrier between me and the street. So that night I pulled out the card and dialed the number. She arrived the next morning at exactly 8. Linda let her in and pointed her toward my bed. Ruth looked exactly the way Linda had described her. Mid-50s, short gray hair, no jewelry, no wasted movement. She wore a simple navy jacket and carried a brown leather briefcase that looked older than I was. She sat down in the folding chair beside my bed and placed the briefcase between us. Stamped faintly into the leather were 5 words written in faded black ink. For Caroline, when she's ready. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandmother's. The air left my lungs. My name is Ruth Kalan, she said calmly. Licensed private investigator, state of Ohio. Your grandmother, Margaret Johansson, hired me 10 years ago. 10 years. I would have been 18. She paid a retainer for a decade of periodic surveillance, Ruth continued, specifically monitoring your parents. Her instructions were very clear. She paused and looked at me. If things ever escalated, I was to find you and give you this. How did you know it had gotten that bad? I asked quietly. When your mother called the shelter pretending to be a social worker, Ruth replied. I was already watching the situation. I've been documenting your parents' interference for 2 years. She opened the briefcase. I have records of 37 calls your mother made to employers, she said, and copies of the documents your father fabricated. I stared at the open case. My grandmother had predicted all of this, almost down to the year. On top of the documents sat a sealed envelope with my name written in Maggie's familiar cursive. I opened it carefully. The letter was short. If you're reading this, things have gotten bad. I'm sorry I couldn't stop your father while I was alive. I tried. I spent 30 years married to a man just like him, and I know how those cages work. They convince you the walls are normal. But I spent my last years making sure you would never be trapped forever. Inside this case is your way out. Use it wisely. Not for revenge, for freedom. I love you more than he ever let me show. Grandma Maggie. My hands stayed steady as I set the letter down. My eyes didn't. Ruth waited until I finished before opening a thick folder inside the case. 5 years of documentation lay inside, neatly organized. Recordings of my mother's calls to employers, 37 of them, each with timestamps and transcripts. In some, she called herself a neighbor. In others, a family friend. Twice, she pretended to be a social worker. There were emails sent from anonymous accounts traced to our home's IP address. Attachments that looked like official police reports. Screenshots. Metadata. Even photographs of the blue notebook in my mother's kitchen, taken through the window during surveillance visits. Is this admissible in court? I asked. Every piece, Ruth said. Ohio is a one-party consent state for recordings. And I'm licensed. Chain of custody is intact. Then she lifted one last envelope from the bottom of the case. A legal envelope sealed with a wax stamp. Law Office of Philip Dern, Millfield, Ohio. Inside were trust documents. Ruth spoke while I read. Your grandmother sold the farm 10 years ago for just under $300,000. She placed the proceeds into a trust managed by a fiduciary. Conservative investments. Treasury bonds, certificates of deposit. I looked down at the summary page, then looked again. $340,000. The sole beneficiary, Ruth said quietly, is you. My father didn't know it existed. That was deliberate. My grandmother had instructed the attorney never to contact my parents under any circumstances. I stared at the papers on the thin shelter mattress. Why didn't she just give it to me sooner? She left instructions about that too, Ruth said. If she gave it to you earlier, Gerald would find a way to take it. She said you had to need it first. Suddenly, everything made sense. The letter, the briefcase, the 10 years of preparation. Philip Dern's office was above a hardware store in downtown Millfield. A narrow staircase led to a quiet waiting room with 2 chairs and a tired-looking fern. Ruth drove me there. I wore the only clean clothes I had, jeans, a borrowed blouse from Linda, and thrift store shoes. Mr. Dern greeted me warmly. Thin man, wire-rimmed glasses, kind eyes. Your grandmother spoke about you often, he said. He verified my ID and documents carefully. When everything matched, he slid a paper across the desk. The trust is active, he said. You have full access starting today. I signed. My hand didn't shake. Then he opened a drawer and handed me another business card. Your grandmother left one more instruction, he said. She wrote that Caroline might need a lawyer before she needs the money. The card read, Ellen Briggs. Civil litigation. I called her that afternoon. By evening, she had reviewed Ruth's entire evidence file. This is defamation per se, she said calmly. In Ohio, falsely claiming someone has a criminal record is automatically actionable. And in your case, we have 3 years of documented damages. The lawsuit was filed that week. My father was served Monday morning while checking the mailbox. My mother received her papers in the cereal aisle at Freshmart. By noon, half the town knew. By dinner, the rest. My phone rang 14 times that afternoon. I didn't answer. Ellen had already told me. From now on, all communication went through legal counsel. At 6:47 p.m., a text arrived. You're going to regret this. I'm your father. Ellen logged it immediately. Exhibit 47. But something had already changed in Harland. Court records are public. And in a small town, people read them. By the end of the week, neighbors had seen the complaint themselves. The fake police reports. The impersonated social worker call. 37 recorded attempts to destroy my employment. For the first time, people began asking my parents questions they couldn't cry their way out of. And once the truth is written down where everyone can read it, it doesn't need a speech that I didn't go door to door telling my story. I didn't post online or call anyone to defend myself. I didn't need to. The evidence already existed. The court records were public, and people in Harland, for all their faults, knew how to read. The town didn't turn on Gerald because I begged them to. They turned because the story he'd been telling stopped making sense once the documents came out. Gerald didn't show up to court. After his attorney withdrew, he represented himself exactly once. His entire response to the lawsuit was a single handwritten page that read, "This is a family matter, and the court has no jurisdiction over a father's right to protect his child." The judge disagreed. When Gerald failed to appear for the hearing, Ellen requested a default judgment. The court granted it. Defamation per se tortious interference with prospective employment. 3 years of documented harm. The total judgment was $85,000. Gerald refused to pay. So Ellen filed a lien against the house on Maple Street. I was sitting in Philip Dern's office when the ruling came through. He printed the judgment and slid it across the same desk where I had signed the trust documents 2 months earlier. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Tired," I said. And I meant it. That same week, something unexpected happened.
Dern offered me a job.
Not out of sympathy. He had watched me organizing Ruth's evidence files, building timelines, cross-referencing dates. "I need an administrative assistant," he said. And you're the most organized person I've seen in 40 years. I started the following Monday. $16.50 an hour. Benefits after 60 days. A desk by the window, and a fern that constantly needed watering. With the money from the trust, I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in Millfield. Ground floor. Tiny kitchen. A front door with a lock and a key that belonged to me. I bought a used Honda Civic with more than 100,000 miles on it. I opened a bank account with only my name on it. For the first time in my life, I walked through a grocery store and bought food without asking anyone's permission. The apartment was quiet. No one monitored my calls. No one checked my email. No one contacted my employer. The silence was almost overwhelming. When the judge read the ruling in court, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel angry. I just felt tired. 3 years of my life had been stolen. 8 months spent sleeping in a shelter bed. All because my parents would rather destroy me than let me live independently. 3 months after the judgment, Linda forwarded me a letter that had arrived at the shelter. Denise had mailed it there, not to my new address. Technically, it didn't violate the protection order, but it came close. I opened it at my kitchen table. Dear Caroline, I'm your mother. I'll always be your mother. Dad says he's sorry. Come home for Thanksgiving dinner. We can put this behind us. I read it twice. Dad says he's sorry. Not Dad is sorry. Just a report, like she was describing the weather. And we can put this behind us. Not I was wrong. Not I shouldn't have called your employers 37 times. Not I forged documents and tried to have you removed from the shelter. Just let's move on. I sat with that letter for a long time. Made coffee. Fed my cat, a tabby from the Millfield Animal Shelter I'd named Maggie for obvious reasons. Then I wrote a response through Ellen, the only way the court order allowed.
Mom.
I wish you well. But love does not include sabotaging your child's ability to survive. You called my employers. You impersonated a social worker. You try to have me removed from the only place I had to sleep. Please respect the court order. Do not contact me again. Caroline. I mailed the letter from the post office in Millfield, not the one in Harland where people still talked. Then I went home. My home. I cooked dinner for one, pasta, garlic bread, and a glass of water. Maggie the cat sat on the counter watching me eat. It was the best meal I'd ever had. I'm not telling this story so people will hate my parents. I'm telling it for anyone who might be lying awake somewhere right now, wondering if wanting their own life makes them a bad daughter or an ungrateful son. It doesn't. Wanting independence isn't betrayal. Wanting to work isn't disrespect. And walking away from people who are actively destroying your life isn't cruelty. It's survival. My grandmother couldn't save herself. She spent 30 years married to a controlling man, my grandfather, before she finally got free. By then she was 70 years old and living in a small apartment. But before she died, she made a plan. She sold her farm, created a trust, hired a private investigator, and sealed a letter inside a briefcase she hoped I'd never have to open. That's what real love looks like. Not control disguised as concern. Not sabotage disguised as protection. Love plans for your freedom, even when it costs everything. I'm 28 now. I work at a law office in Millfield. I'm saving for community college. I have a one-bedroom apartment, a used Honda, and a cat named Maggie who sheds on everything I own. And I don't speak to my parents. The door isn't locked forever. But the key belongs to me now. Gerald eventually had to sell the house. The lien meant the judgment had to be paid before the property could transfer. The house sold for $168,000. After fees, taxes, and the judgment, he walked away with barely enough to rent somewhere else. He and Denise moved to a trailer park 20 minutes away. Gerald still tells people the same story, that his daughter was brainwashed by a lawyer. Some people would rather lose everything than admit they were wrong. Denise, though, did something I didn't expect. Months later, Ruth told me she had started seeing a therapist. Apparently during her 3rd session, she said, "I think I did something terrible. I don't know what to do with that yet. I'm not ready to forgive her. Maybe I never will be. But I can hold 2 truths at the same time. The woman who tried to destroy my life, and the woman who finally admitted, at least to someone, that she had done something wrong. People are complicated, but complicated doesn't mean they're entitled to your life. Sometimes healing requires distance. And sometimes freedom is simply closing a door and keeping the key